So this lab is about the nested for loop. So we'll be using for loops, but we'll be using more than one for loop, and those for loops will be related to each other. One would be nested inside the other. So what do we mean by that? Let me show you what do I mean. What do we mean by that? So first of all, this is your Octave software, the graphical user interface. This is the command window that you see. If you come here, next to the command window we have the editor tab. So if you click on the editor tab, you move to the editor. This is where you can write your script file. Okay, on the command window you can enter individual commands, and here in the editor you can type multiple commands, and then you can execute those commands as a batch, as one command. So you can create a file which contains more than one Octave commands, and then you can execute those multiple Octave commands as a single batch file, a single file or a single command. But when that command is executed, when that file is executed, so all the commands in this particular script file, they will be executed one by one sequentially, starting from the command at line number 1, then line number 2, line number 3, line number 4. Okay, so they'll be executed one by one sequentially. So this is your script file. When you open the editor, you can see like there it's written unnamed. So this script file does not have any name. We have not named it yet. So if you press Ctrl plus S, or if you go to the file menu, and print save file, okay, so you will see this dialog box. This is the save as dialog box. The first time when you save a file, so you have this save as dialog box. Here you can specify the name and the place where you want to store this file. You can do both of these here. So this is say lab 6, and today is 24th May 2022. So this is how we want to name this file. Now make sure that you name this file, and the name should start with a letter, okay, with an alphabet. It should not be a number. You should not start the name of a file with a number. That would be an error. You would not be able to call that file. Okay, so the file name, it must start from an alphabet. It must start with an alphabet. Make sure you do that. Then you can press the save button. You can click on it, and now the name of the file has changed. It is lab 6 24th May 2022. Okay, so this is our script file. Script file means that it contains Octave commands or MATLAB commands. It is called the same in MATLAB as well, and its extension is .m. If you look at this file name, its full name is lab 6 24 May 2022.m. So .m is the extension of this file. The script files that you'll create in MATLAB, they also have this extension .m. So m is for MATLAB. M, you can think of m is for MATLAB. Okay? So this is a MATLAB script file. You are using Octave to create it, but Octave is compatible with MATLAB. Whatever you do in Octave, you can do the same in MATLAB as well. Now we are going to use nested for loop. Now what do we mean by nested for loop? So first of all, you should know what do we mean by a simple, like what is a simple for loop? How do we use a simple for loop? Now let us look at this particular Octave command, display G. So let us look at this Octave command. Okay, display hello. What would it do? When we run this script file, it would display hello on the command window once. It would display the word or the string hello, this string, on the Octave command window once. Okay, so when you execute this script file, say for example when I say run, so on the command window we will have this output hello ... and this would be displayed once. Okay, This is simple, right? Now if I want to display hello multiple times, so there are two options. One is I copy this command and I paste it like this. Say for example I want it to be displayed 5 times. This is one way of doing it. I type this command 5 times. Okay. Now before we execute this file, we want the command window to be cleared, so we can type the CLC command at the very beginning. So whenever this file is executed, the command window will be cleared and you will see the output of this, the current execution of this file. So this is one way of doing it. One way of doing what? So we want to display the message hello multiple times. So one way of doing it is to type this command display hello as many times as you want this message to be printed on the screen. When you run this file, this is what you'll see on the output. The message hello 5 times, printed 5 times. Okay. So this is one way of doing it. The other way of doing the same thing is that you should use a loop. You should use a loop. A loop is a language structure in Octave that allows you to repeat the execution of a command. If you want a particular command to be executed more than once, to be executed repeatedly again and again, so you can use a loop. Okay. How can you use a loop? Like we have talked about these loops. We said that in Octave we have the for loop and the while loop. Okay. If you want to use the for loop, this is how you use the for loop. You can say for, the keyword for, and then you can create a vector. As many values as that vector has, this loop would be executed that many times. So we can say for I is equal to 1 to 5. For I is equal to 1 to 5. So this particular command will generate the values 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I will have these values 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 possible values. For each value of I, so this is basically the syntax of the for loop. We can move this particular this is the syntax for the for loop. It starts with the keyword for, it ends with the keyword end. Okay, for end. This is where the for loop begins. This is where the for loop ends. Between this for and end keyword, you type the commands that you want to execute repeatedly. So we want the message hello to be printed 5 times on the screen. In order to display this message once, we use this command display, and then within the brackets we pass this input hello. So this message would be displayed once when this command is executed once. Okay. Now we want this message to be printed 5 times. So for that we need to execute this command 5 times. Okay. So one way was to type this command 5 times. That was a very basic kind of way, but it is not the ideal way, the best way to do it. Why? Because that way is not scalable. If you want this message to be printed 1,000 times, then you have to type this command 1,000 times, if we go by that method. The other better way of doing it is to use a loop. Now a loop is something, this is what a for loop looks like. In Octave we have 2 types of loop. One is the for loop, the other is the while loop. Both loops, their purpose is to repeat the execution of a command. If you want a command to be executed repeatedly, then you can use a loop. So this is the for loop, and this is the syntax of the for loop. It starts with the keyword for, it ends with the keyword end, and here you specify how many times is this for loop going to execute. So how do you specify? You specify a loop counter. I is the loop counter. I is the loop counter. It tells you how many times is this loop going to execute. So the loop counter starts with the value 1 and it goes up until the value 5, and from while going from 1 to 5, the value of the loop counter is executed by 1 each time. So the initial value of the loop counter would be 1, then its value would be 2, 3, 4, 5. For each value of I, the loop counter, this particular loop or this command that is within the body of the for loop, this is going to be executed once. So when you execute this script file, this particular command display hello would be executed 5 times. Why would it execute 5 times? Because the value of the loop counter I, it varies from 1 to 5. It varies from 1 to 5. It starts with 1, then 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay? So for each value of I, this loop would be executed once. So when we execute this code, this is the output that we see. Okay? If we want this loop to execute it 10 times, so you can change the end value to 10. The start value is 1, the default step size is 1, and the end value is 10. The end value is 10. So you can execute it 10 times. You can execute it, and when you execute this script file, this message would be printed 10 times. Why would it be printed 10 times? Because this loop would execute this statement at line number 3 10 times. For each value of I, this statement would be executed once. Okay? So when we execute it again, the message hello is printed 10 times. Now let's do something useful. Say for example, we want to print the odd numbers. Odd numbers, say between 1 and 100. Okay? We want to print the odd numbers between 1 and 100. So how can we do that? So the first odd number is 1. The second odd number would be 1 plus 2. The third odd number would be 1 plus 2 plus 2, or 3 plus 2. That would be 5. Then the next would be 5 plus 2. So starting from 1 and with a step size of 2, you can print all the odd numbers between 1 and 100. Between 1 and 100. 100 is the end value. Okay? So we want to print all the odd numbers. Display I. So I would be the odd number. It would start with 1, then its next value would be 3, 5, 7, so on and so forth. Okay? So when you run this code, so first the value of I, which is 1, that would be printed, then the value of I would become 3, that would be printed, then 5, then 7, then 9, then 11, so on and so forth. Okay? So ये कहाँ तक जाएगा? This would go up until 99. So the last odd number that you'll see on your screen would be 99. The end value is 100. 100 is an even value. So after that, when I reaches 99, so the next value would be 101. So then this loop would stop executing. You will get out of this loop. You will get out of this loop. So if you run this code, this is what you are going to see on the output. Okay? So I is going to start from 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, 13 up until 99. Okay. Now say for example you want to print even numbers. So the only change that you need to make to this code is you start I with the value 2. Okay, the start value becomes 2. So this time it would display all the even numbers. So on the command window you will have all the even numbers starting from 2 up until 100. Okay? Now these are pretty easy, straightforward tasks. If you remember, let's make it more complicated. If you remember, we wrote a program that would check whether a number is odd or even. Okay, So that program checked a single number, whether that number is odd or even. Now here we want to make it more complicated. We'll have a vector and we'll check in that vector, starting from the first value in the vector going up until the last value in that vector. We'll check each value, whether that value is odd or even. Okay, so for that we'll create a vector and we will populate that vector with some random values. So how do you create a vector? You simply write a is equal to, so a would be that vector, and we want to assign some random values to this vector, random integer values. So we have talked about this function rand I. Rand I function generates random integer values. Okay? So what do you give as input to this function? So first of all, you give a range of values to this function. Okay? What kind of values do you want to generate? Okay? So we want, say for example, values between say 1 and 1000 or 0 and 1000. So we can specify this value 1000. So that is the maximum integer value that we want to have in this vector. Okay? And then we specify the size or the dimensions for this vector. So this is going to be a vector. We want a single row, and we want say around 50 values in it. So this is going to be a vector with a single row and 50 columns. Okay? If you are not sure how rand I function would behave, you can go to the command window and you can check how the rand I or random integer function behaves. So say for example we say random integer and we specify this value 100. This is the maximum value that we want in this vector, and we want this vector to be a row vector of size 1 by 10, a single row with 10 columns. The first value specifies the maximum random integer value that you want in this vector, and the next two values, they specify the dimensions of this vector. So we want it to be a row vector. It has a single row and it has 10 columns. So if you press enter, this is what you see on the screen. So you have values starting from say 1 to 100, and you have a row vector with 10 values. Okay, so you can see that this is how it behaves. So this particular vector will have a maximum value of 1000. All the values would be randomly generated, and the size of this vector would be 1 by 50. It will have a single row and 50 columns. Okay, and we put a semicolon here because we want to suppress the output. We don't want the output to be printed on the command window. Okay, if you put a semicolon here, the vector is generated but you don't see the output here. Okay, so this semicolon, it suppresses the output. You don't see anything on the screen, but the vector a, it is generated. Okay, say if you say a is equal to random integer and then 100, 1 by say 10. Okay, so the vector a is generated. It has these random values, but you don't see any output on the screen. Now let's get back to our script file. So we have all these values in the vector a, okay, and these are 50 values. Now we want to check one by one which value is odd and which value is even. So we will access individual values in the vector a one by one, starting from the value stored at index number 1. Now in the previous lab we learned how can you access individual values in a vector. I hope you remember that. Okay? So this is the vector a. If you want to access the first value in vector a, how do you do that? So you simply say vector a and the value at index number 1. Just like you guys are in this class and you must have some class number. So if I say class number 1, so basically I am trying to access or trying to call the student at class number 1 in this class. Okay? So if you have a vector, you know that vector has multiple values and the vector's name is a. So how do you access individual values in that vector? You specify the index for that individual value. In Octave, the index starts from 1 and it goes up until the length of this vector. So vector a, its length is 100. So the first value in this vector is A1. So if I say A1, I access 98. This is the first value, you can see it here. And the last value in this vector, that would be A100, because 100 is the size or length of this vector. 100 is the length of this vector. So A100 would be, it is 10, sorry. It is not 100, it is 10. The length is 10. 100 is the maximum value, okay? The length of this vector is 10. So the 10th value is 21. The last value in this vector A is 21. Here in this particular vector it is 50, but this code has not executed yet, okay? So the vector A that we have right now, its dimension is 1 by 10. So the first value in this vector is 1 and the last value in this vector is 10. The point is, if you want to access individual elements in a vector, so all you need to do is specify the name of the vector and the index of that value. Okay? Now here we want to access all the values in this vector A one by one. Okay? So we need to have an index that starts from 1 and that goes up until the last value in this vector. Okay? So we are going to use index I, and the index is going to start from 1 and it is going to increment by 1, and the last value of this index would be the length of the vector A. The length of the vector A. Okay? Why are we having this thing here? Because the program that we want to write, or the script file that we want to write, is we have this vector A. It has 50 elements, and we want to check all those 50 elements for evenness or oddness. We want to see which element is odd and which element is even. That is what we want to see. Okay? Now in order to be able to do that, we need to access all the elements one by one, and the elements start from index 1 up until index 50, which is the length of vector A. The length of vector A is 50, so you can access it using this function length. Okay? You can try it here, length of A. So we have this vector A, okay, and we want to know what is its length. So its length is 10. You can create another vector, say B. B is all zeros and its size is, say, 1 by 700, say for example. Okay? So we want to know the length of B. So the length of B is 700. So the length function, it returns you the length of a vector. It returns you the length of a vector, the number of elements in a vector. Let me clear all these things. Okay. So the length of A would return you the length or number of elements in A. The index, which we can use to access individual elements in a vector, it starts from 1 and it goes up until the length of that vector. Okay? It goes up until the length of that vector. Now, so if we want to display this element, ith element in the vector A, how can we display it? So we can say AI, display AI. Okay? Display AI. So let me make the size as 10. We want to first display those elements one by one. Okay? So let us run this code. So this is the vector A. These are the individual elements of the vector A. We have displayed these elements. Okay? So we can access individual elements using this loop. Now we want to find out which element is odd and which is even. How do you find that? How can you find whether a particular number or element is odd or even? So you need to divide it by 2 and look at the remainder. Now if you remember, we talked about a function mod. Okay? Mod. So mod of, say, 319, when it is divided by 2. Mod is shortcut for modulo. Modulo returns you the remainder. So when you divide 319 by 2, what would be the remainder? 1. 319 is an odd number. When you divide it by 2, you'll get 1 as the remainder. If you have some even number, say for example 3120, and you divide it by 2, you'll get 0 as the remainder. Okay? So using the mod function, you can determine whether a number is odd or even. If the mod function returns 1, then the number is odd. If the mod function returns 0, then the number is even. So how are we going to find out? We are going to use the if structure, okay? And we are going to call the mod function, और mod function को हम पहली input देंगे ai, the ith element of vector a, और दूसरा input देंगे 2. So the mod function would return us either 1 or 0 depending upon कि ai की क्या value है. If whatever value it returns, if that value is equal to 0, अगर ये वैल्यू 0 के बराबर है, तो फिर ये जो नंबर है ये क्या है? It is even. This number is even. ai is even. If that is not the case, ठीक है, then ai is odd. Then ai is odd. ठीक है? So we are accessing individual elements of the vector A starting from the element at index 1, ठीक है, and going up until the last element in this vector. And then we pass this individual element ai to the function mod along with 2. So the mod function divides ai by 2 and returns you the remainder. ठीक है? ये आपको remainder return करता है. You compare that remainder with 0. If the remainder is equal to 0, this condition would be true and this statement would be executed. Display is even. So पहले हमने वो नंबर यहाँ पे डिस्प्ले कर दिया हुआ है, उसके बाद हम सिर्फ ये मैसेज is even डिस्प्ले करना चाहते हैं. ठीक है? अच्छा, if this condition is not true, अगर ये कंडीशन फॉल्स है, फिर ये else वाली स्टेटमेंट एग्जीक्यूट होगी. ये कंडीशन कब फॉल्स होगी? जब रिमाइंडर हमारे पास 1 के बराबर हो, 0 के बराबर ना हो. जब रिमाइंडर 1 के बराबर होगा तो वो नंबर जो है वो ऑड होगा, तो हम ये मैसेज प्रिंट करना चाहते हैं. ठीक है? ओके, सो लेट्स रन दिस कोड and let's see the output here. So the first number in that vector is 714. 714 is even. The next is 756, it is even. उसके बाद 564, it is even. 49 is odd. 78 is even. 438 even. 978 even. 409 odd. 745 odd. 126 even. ठीक है? So this way you can check all the numbers in a vector whether they are odd or even. ठीक है? Using a for loop. So we created a vector with random values and then we are using a for loop to access individual elements of this vector and to check whether those elements are odd or even. Whether those elements are odd or even. ठीक है? Understand? ओके, सो नाउ यहाँ पे मैं थोड़ा सा वेरिएबल्स के नाम ज़रा चेंज कर रहा हूँ. ठीक है? ये जो इंडेक्स i है, you should not be using I as an index. This was a mistake. Why? अच्छा, because let me clear these variables. I जो है ना, it is a special value in octave. It is for iota, the complex number iota. ठीक है? Similarly, j is also special, ठीक है. It is also a shortcut for iota, the complex number iota. So you should not be using I and j as variables, ठीक है. This was a mistake, लेकिन इसको अभी correct कर लेते हैं. So let's use c as the loop counter. अगर आप यूज कर भी लें कोई इशू तो नहीं होता, लेकिन you should not be using it. You should be aware of the fact that I and j, they are shortcuts or other names for the complex value iota, ठीक है. Complex value iota, which is -1 under root, square root of -1, उसके बराबर जो है. So let me replace I with c, ठीक है. अच्छा, now just to demonstrate the use of nested for loops. Nested for loops से क्या मुराद है, या when do you need to use nested for loops, सिर्फ उसको demonstrate करने के लिए we are going to modify this code, ठीक है. Otherwise this is not the best code to demonstrate the use of nested for loop, ठीक है. तो अब हम क्या करेंगे, like ये कोड क्या करता है, this code generates a vector with random integer values and then checks each value in that vector for odd or evenness, ठीक है. यही काम करता है ना ये कोड, ठीक है. अच्छा, अब हमने क्या करना है, we will modify this code. और modify कैसे करना है, we will generate a matrix of random values, ठीक है. we will generate a matrix of random values और फिर उस matrix के individual rows को हम one by one एक्सेस करेंगे, रो 1, रो 2, रो 3, रो 4, और फिर उन रोज को, उनके इंडिविजुअल एलिमेंट्स को हम एक्सेस करेंगे और चेक करेंगे कि वेदर दे आर ऑड और इवन, ठीक है. अंडरस्टैंड. नाउ दिस कोड, this particular code, it, or in fact this particular code, it checks whether a particular individual elements of a vector for oddness or evenness. हमारे पास एक वेक्टर है और उस वेक्टर के इंडिविजुअल एलिमेंट्स को ये ऑड और इवननेस के लिए चेक करता है. सो वी आर गोइंग टू मॉडिफाई दिस कोड. और मॉडिफाई हमने किस तरह करना है, वी आर गोइंग टू जनरेट अ मैट्रिक्स. उस मैट्रिक्स में रोज होंगे और कॉलम्स होंगे. सो हमने बारी बारी पहले रो 1 को उठाना है, रो वेक्टर 1 को, और उसके तमाम एलिमेंट्स को चेक करना है कि वो ऑड है या इवन है. फिर रो वेक्टर 2, रो वेक्टर 3, रो वेक्टर 4, ठीक है. दिस इज हाउ वी आर गोइंग टू डू. कैसे करेंगे? सो फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल let us generate a matrix. Let me call that matrix as M, ठीक है. And it's going to be a matrix of order 10 by 10. It's going to be a matrix of order 10 by 10, ठीक है. अच्छा जी. So M is a matrix with random integer values in the range of 1 to 1000. And its order is 10 by 10. It has 10 rows and 10 columns. So what do we want to do? We want to access individual rows of the matrix M one by one, and then we want to verify, we want to check individual elements of those row vectors for oddness or evenness, ठीक है. That is what we want to do. तो ये जो कोड है, this code checks individual elements of a vector A for oddness or evenness. इस कोड को हम नहीं छेड़ेंगे, ठीक है. इस कोड को हम नहीं छेड़ेंगे. सिर्फ इसको हम जो इंडिविजुअल जो वेक्टर A है वो बार बार इसको चेंज करके देंगे. सो फर्स्ट वेक्टर A जो है ना, वो मैट्रिक्स M का फर्स्ट रो होगी, उसकी फर्स्ट रो होगी. हाउ डू यू एक्सेस individual rows of a matrix? If you remember, this is what we did in our last lab session, ठीक है. Say for example this is a matrix. Let us create a matrix D, and D is equal to rand I 100 5 by 5, ठीक है. So say for example this is D. If you want to access the second row of D, how would you access it? You say D second row and all columns, second row and all columns of second row. So this allows you to access the entire second row, ठीक है. If you want to access the fifth row, 5 and all elements of the fifth row. So this allows you to access all elements of the fifth row. अच्छा. So C, you can read C as column, ठीक है. So we'll access a row vector, ठीक है, and then we will assign that row vector to the variable a. So a would be some row vector from the matrix M. ठीक है, कौन सा वाला रो वेक्टर होगा? rth रो वेक्टर होगा, ठीक है. So a would be the row vector at index r, ठीक है, and here we specify कि हम उस रो वेक्टर के तमाम कॉलम्स को एक्सेस करना चाह रहे हैं, ठीक है. अच्छा, so r जो इंडेक्स है इसकी स्टार्टिंग वैल्यू क्या होगी? 1, फिर 2, 3, 4, और इस मैट्रिक्स में जितनी रोज हैं, ठीक है, वो उसकी फिर फाइनल वैल्यू होगी. सो हाउ वुड यू फाइंड आउट कि इस मैट्रिक्स में कितनी रोज हैं? जी 10 रोज हैं. बट डू वी हैव अ फंक्शन टू फाइंड आउट द नंबर ऑफ रोज एंड कॉलम्स इन मैट्रिक्स? So if you remember, we studied the size function, size of D. So D is a matrix. Size of D returns you a vector 5 by 5, 5 rows, 5 columns. पहली जो वैल्यू है that is rows, दूसरी जो वैल्यू है that is columns. ठीक है, इसको अगर चेंज कर लें, say for example 5 by 10. So D is a matrix with 5 rows and 10 columns. Say for example, अगर आप कहें size of D, so you get 5, 10. 5, 10. 5 is the number of rows in D, 10 is the number of columns in D. So we can get the number of rows in any matrix using the size function. ठीक है, तो ये size function आपको जो वैल्यू रिटर्न कर रहा है उसकी जो पहला, it returns you a vector, ठीक है. So उसकी पहली वैल्यू that would be the number of rows, ठीक है. So let's access that. So let's declare a variable s, and s would store the size of M, size of matrix M, ठीक है. यहां पे आप इसको टेस्ट कर लें. Let's say s is equal to size of D. S is 5, 10. So the first value in the vector s, that is the number of rows. The first value in the vector s, that is the number of rows, ठीक है. अच्छा, सो हमारा ये जो वेरिएबल r है, इट विल स्टार्ट फ्रॉम द वैल्यू 1, और इसकी फाइनल वैल्यू क्या होगी? द नंबर ऑफ रोज इन द मैट्रिक्स M, जो कि स्टोर्ड हैं इन द वेक्टर S एट इंडेक्स 1. यहाँ पे नंबर ऑफ रोज इन मैट्रिक्स M स्टोर्ड हैं, ठीक है ना. ये हमने यहाँ पे डेमोन्स्ट्रेट कर लिया. एक मैट्रिक्स D का हमने साइज कैलकुलेट किया, उस साइज ने जो वैल्यू रिटर्न की उसको हमने S वेरिएबल में स्टोर की, और S वेरिएबल बेसिकली इट इज अ वेक्टर. उसकी जो पहली वैल्यू है दैट इज द नंबर ऑफ रोज, दैट इज द नंबर ऑफ रोज, ठीक है. सो R जो है इसकी इनिशियल वैल्यू होगी 1, और इसकी फाइनल वैल्यू होगी द नंबर ऑफ रोज इन M. सो बारी बारी हम मैट्रिक्स M की रोज एक्सेस करेंगे. पहले फर्स्ट रो, सेकेंड रो, थर्ड रो, ठीक है. अच्छा, यहाँ पे डू नॉट फॉरगेट टू ऐड दिस एंड कीवर्ड. ये फॉर यहाँ पे एंड हो रही है, ठीक है. सो नाउ यू कैन सी वी आर यूजिंग 2 फॉर लूप्स. वी आर यूजिंग 2 फॉर लूप्स. दिस इज द इनर फॉर लूप, ठीक है. लेट अस कॉल इट, दिस इज द इनर फॉर लूप. इनर फॉर लूप, या इसको हम कहते हैं नेस्टेड फॉर लूप, इनर और नेस्टेड फॉर लूप. दिस इज द आउटर फॉर लूप, ठीक है. सो वन फॉर लूप इज नेस्टेड विद इन अनदर फॉर लूप. वन फॉर लूप इज नेस्टेड विद इन अनदर फॉर लूप, ठीक है. अच्छा, फॉर ईच वैल्यू ऑफ r, फॉर ईच वैल्यू ऑफ r, this for loop will be executed entirely, fully, ठीक है. फॉर एग्जाम्पल यहाँ पे ये जो मैट्रिक्स है हमारे पास, इसकी साइज क्या है? 10 by 10. सो फॉर ईच वैल्यू ऑफ r, दिस लूप वुड बी एग्जीक्यूटेड 10 times. ये जो कोड है ना, इट वुड बी एग्जीक्यूटेड 10 times. सो फॉर ईच वैल्यू ऑफ r हम क्या करते हैं? वी एक्सेस अ रो वेक्टर इन द मैट्रिक्स M. तो ये लूप क्या करती है? ये जो इनर फॉर लूप है, ये उस रो वेक्टर के हर एलिमेंट को, जो कि 10 एलिमेंट्स हैं, चेक करती है कि वो एलिमेंट ऑड है या इवन है। जब वो चेक कर लेती है फिर इट मूव्स टू द नेक्स्ट रो वेक्टर, ठीक है। तो यहां पे हम डिस्प्ले कर सकते हैं डिस्प्ले एक्सेसिंग रो नंबर डिस्प्ले आर। तो हम रो नंबर 1 को एक्सेस कर रहे हैं, फिर रो नंबर 2 को एक्सेस कर रहे हैं, रो नंबर 3 को, ठीक है। अच्छा, नाउ दिस फॉर लूप इट विल बेसिकली टेक अ मैट्रिक्स और उस मैट्रिक्स के तमाम रो वेक्टर्स को बारी बारी एक्सेस करेंगे, फिर उस हर रो वेक्टर में जो इंडिविजुअल एलिमेंट्स हैं उनको एक्सेस करके चेक करेगा कि वो ऑड हैं या इवन है, ठीक है। दिस इज बेसिकली to demonstrate how you can nest one for loop in another for loop to do something like this, ठीक है। So at times आपको इस किस्म के काम करने की ज़रूरत पड़ सकती है। अच्छा, सॉरी। So let us run this code, ठीक है जी। ये अच्छा, यहां पे हम क्या करना चाह रहे हैं, ये क्या चीज है, दिस इज मैट्रिक्स M, ठीक है। और ये मैट्रिक्स M की हम rth रो एट इंडेक्स R उसको एक्सेस करना चाह रहे हैं, द कंप्लीट रो वेक्टर एट इंडेक्स R। सो दिस इज व्हाट वी आर ट्राइंग टू डू, उसको हम एक्सेस करना चाह रहे हैं। इसको मैंने यहां पे आपको डेमोन्स्ट्रेट किया था कि फॉर एग्जाम्पल दिस इज द मैट्रिक्स D। मैट्रिक्स D की अगर आप सेकंड रो एक्सेस करना चाहते हैं तो यू से D एंड देन रो इंडेक्स में यू स्पेसिफाई 2 और कॉलम इंडेक्स में यू स्पेसिफाई द फुल कॉलम, ठीक है। सो दैट मीन्स यू वांट टू एक्सेस ऑल द कॉलम्स इन रो नंबर 2। यहां पे फर्क सिर्फ ये है कि बजाय एक कांस्टेंट वैल्यू स्पेसिफाई करने के वी आर स्पेसिफाइंग R which starts with the value 1 and goes up until the number of rows in the matrix M, ठीक है, the number of rows in the matrix M, ठीक है। So here A जो है it would be the first row vector in M, फिर second row vector, फिर third row vector, fourth row vector, fifth row vector, बारी बारी। इसको हमने A को क्यों असाइन किया, इसलिए असाइन किया बिकॉज वी डू नॉट वांट टू चेंज दिस कोड। ये कोड हमने पहले लिखा था एंड दिस कोड वाज फॉर चेकिंग the individual elements of a vector A for oddness or evenness। इसको हम नहीं चेंज कर रहे, ठीक है। इसको हम सिर्फ अपग्रेड कर रहे हैं so that it is able to check the all the rows of a matrix M बारी बारी उनको चेक करने के लिए कि उनके जो एलिमेंट्स हैं वो ऑड हैं या इवन हैं। अच्छा, ये कोड अब क्या करेगी, सो वील जनरेट अ मैट्रिक्स M विद रैंडम वैल्यूज between 1 and 1000 और उसके डायमेंशंस क्या होंगे 5 by 10, 5 रोज 10 कॉलम्स, ठीक है। सो हम बारी बारी पहले रो 1, फिर रो 2, फिर रो 3, फिर रो 4, रो 5, रो 6 उनको चेक करेंगे कि वो ऑड है या इवन है, ठीक है। जी हाँ, यहां पे 7, लाइन नंबर 7, अच्छा सही, दिस वुड बी एन एरर, ठीक है। सो वी नीड टू प्रोवाइड अ क्लोजिंग पैरेंथेसिस फॉर ईच ओपनिंग पैरेंथेसिस, ठीक है। इफ यू डोंट डू इट दिस वुड बी एन एरर, थैंक यू। अच्छा, लेट अस रन दिस कोड। जब आप इस कोड को रन कर लेते हैं, सो दिस इज द मैट्रिक्स M, ठीक है। मैट्रिक्स M को हमने प्रिंट किया ताकि पता लगे कि मैट्रिक्स M में पहली रो में कौन से एलिमेंट्स हैं, दूसरी रो में, तीसरी रो में। नाउ फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल वी सी एक्सेसिंग रो नंबर 1। सो पहले हम रो नंबर 1 को एक्सेस करते हैं और उसके इंडिविजुअल एलिमेंट्स को चेक करते हैं फॉर ऑडनेस और इवननेस, ठीक है। सो वो ये रो नंबर 1 को चेक करता है बारी बारी उसके तमाम एलिमेंट्स को, फिर वी आर एक्सेसिंग रो नंबर 2, ठीक है। सो रो नंबर 2 का पहला एलिमेंट इज 277, देन 8, 226। तो बारी बारी इन तमाम एलिमेंट्स को चेक किया जाता है फॉर ऑड और इवननेस। फिर रो नंबर 3, रो नंबर 4, रो नंबर 5, ठीक है, एंड देन दैट्स इट, ठीक है। आप फॉलो कर रहे हैं? फॉलो कर रहे हैं कि बातें कर रहे हैं? ठीक है। So these labs are individual. This is not a group activity right now unless I say so. And the exam, the final lab task, the viva, everything would be individual. So pay attention. Okay? Do not engage in chit chat during the lab session. So this is, we used a for loop, a nested for loop or two nested for loops to demonstrate. Basically we use two for loops, two nested for loops to check the individual elements of a matrix for oddness or evenness. ठीक है? This may not be a very good example of demonstrating nested for loops. We'll look at another example. ठीक है? And that example would be to check numbers for primality, whether a number is a prime number or not. We want to check that. ठीक है? So how can we do that? ठीक है? So in order to check a single number for primality, whether that number is prime or not, we need a for loop. ठीक है? So let me create another script file. You can create a new script file by pressing this new button or going to the file menu and pressing the new script command. ठीक है? And let us store it. Let us save it. Sorry. This is lab 6. 24th May 2022 and this is second example. ठीक है? Okay, now before we start, let us clear the command window and let us clear the workspace variables. Okay, so you should always do these two things: clear the command window, clear the workspace variables, so that there is no clash between the variables that you declare or use, ठीक है, and the ones that are already in the workspace. Acha. Now what do we want to do? So we want to check a particular number for primality, whether that number is prime or not. That is what we want to do. ठीक है? Whether that number is prime or not. So let us store that number in the variable n. ठीक है? And let us generate that number randomly. So let the number be in the range 1 to 1000 and let it be a scalar. ठीक है? So we are generating a scalar number. We are generating a scalar number, but we are generating it randomly. We are generating it randomly. ठीक है? Now we want to find out, we want to determine whether this number is prime or not. We want to determine whether this number is prime or not. How can we determine that? What is a prime number? First of all, you should know about that. A prime number is a number which is divisible only by 1 and itself. By 1 and itself. ठीक है? If a number is not divisible by any number other than 1 in itself, then that number is a prime number. ठीक है? So how can you instruct this computer to find out whether a number is prime or not? So if I give you a number, say for example I ask you 791, find out whether 791 is prime or not. So how would you find out? You'll start dividing 791 by different numbers, by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. You'll go up until half of 791 and you'll find out whether there is any number which divides 791 or not. If you find a number which divides 791, then 791 is not a prime number. If you cannot find any number between 2 and half of 791 which divides 791, then 791 is a prime number. That is how we are going to do it. And in order to do something like this, you need a loop in a computer, because you have to do repeated division. You have to repeatedly divide n by some number and you have to see the remainder. ठीक है? You have to see the remainder. Or you can count the factors of n. if you start dividing n from 2 to half of n and you have 0 factors, so that means n is a prime number. If you have more than 0 factors, that means n is not a prime number. ठीक है? You can go either way. कोई भी तरीका आप इख्तियार कर सकते हैं. So say for example we go by counting the number of factors. ठीक है? So we have a variable factors. Let me initialize it to 0. Initially every number has 0 factors, and then we start dividing this number by another number, ठीक है, by d, and d would start from 2 and it would go up until n by 2. So the initial value of d would be 2, the final value of d would be half of n, and we'll divide n by d and we'll look at the remainder. So what are we going to do? We are going to divide n by d and we are going to look at the remainder. That means we need to use the mod function again. So we are going to divide n by d and we are going to check the remainder. If the remainder is equal to 0, that means d is a factor. That means d is a factor. So we have found a factor, so we need to increment the variable factors. ठीक है? And if. That's it. Once we are out of this for loop, if we have 0 factors, if factors is equal to 0, that means n is a prime number. ठीक है? That means display n and then display this message is a prime number. Else, if factors is not equal to 0, that means n is not a prime number. N is not a prime number. Acha, look again, what are we doing here? We are generating a random number n. We want to check whether n is prime number or not. How can we check whether a number is prime number or not? So the only way of doing that is you start dividing that number by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. You go up until half of that number, and if you find any factor between 2 and half of that number, that means this number is not a prime number. If there is no factor between 2 and half of that number, that means this number is a prime number. So you count the number of factors that you find. Initially, we initialize factors to 0, and if we find a factor, we increment factors. And once we are out of this loop, we check whether the factors is 0 or not. If it is 0, that means the number is prime number. If it is not, that means the number is not a prime number. ठीक है? So this code, this script will check only one number for primality. Okay? If you run this code, syntax error. अच्छा जी, कहाँ पे? line number 16 में we have an error. Line number 16. अच्छा, display is a prime number. 16 is here. अच्छा, else के बाद we don't have. If else जो है ना, you have to end it with end, the keyword end. If else, and then it has to be ended with the keyword end. ठीक है? अच्छा, now so let's see the output. Now n is 880, ठीक है? And it is not a prime number, which is understandable. Let's run it again. 120 is not a prime number, 361 is not a prime number, 737 is not a prime number, 883 is a prime number. ठीक है? अच्छा, fine. Now this is a code that generates one random value and then checks whether that random value is prime or not. ठीक है? Now what if we want to check What if we want to generate a vector of random values and then we want to check all those values one by one for primality, whether they are prime or not. ठीक है, थोड़ा सा अब इस प्रॉब्लम को मॉडिफाई करते हैं. कैसे मॉडिफाई करते हैं कि नाउ वी वांट टू चेक वेदर a vector of random values, whether each value in that vector is prime or not. So we'll generate a vector of random values and then we will check individual values in that vector for primality. ठीक है, तो वो कैसे करेंगे? So you should know कि आपका कौन सा कोड चेक करता है किसी एक नंबर की प्राइमैलिटी को. This is the code which checks the number n for primality. ठीक है, this is the code which checks the number n for primality. अब हमने प्रॉब्लम को ज़रा मुख्तलिफ तरीके से फॉर्मुलेट कर लिया. अब we want to have a vector say a and that vector is a row vector with 100 values, 100 random values, and we want to check each value in this row vector a for primality कि वो प्राइम है या नहीं. तो कैसे चेक करेंगे? वी नीड टू एक्सेस ईच वैल्यू इन दिस वेक्टर ए. वो हम कैसे एक्सेस करेंगे? सो फॉर से डी को हम यूज कर एन को यूज कर रहे हैं. सो लेट्स यूज आर एज एन इंडेक्स. सो आर इज इक्वल टू 1 2 द लेंथ ऑफ ए. ठीक है, और ये जो पूरा कोड है ये इस फॉर लूप का हिस्सा होगा. So this for loop will start from here and it will repeat this entire code which basically checks a single number for primality. इसको repeat करेगा. ठीक है, अच्छा, तो हम ये जो रो वेक्टर हमने जनरेट किया है A, इसके इंडिविजुअल एलिमेंट्स को एक्सेस करेंगे और उसको स्टोर करेंगे इन द वेरिएबल n. ठीक है, सो हम इसके इंडिविजुअल एलिमेंट्स को एक्सेस कर रहे हैं. हम इसके इंडिविजुअल एलिमेंट्स को. सो दिस इज द वेक्टर ए. 100 एलिमेंट्स का वेक्टर है और इस रो वेक्टर के हर एलिमेंट को बारी बारी स्टार्टिंग फ्रॉम इंडेक्स 1 अप अंटिल द लेंथ ऑफ ए हम इसको एक्सेस कर रहे हैं एंड वी आर असाइनिंग इट टू द वेरिएबल n. फिर ये वाला जो कोड है ये चेक करता है कि आया n प्राइम नंबर है या नहीं. ये पहले हम लिख चुके हैं. ठीक है, सो नाउ वी आर रिपीटिंग दिस कोड यूजिंग अ नेस्टेड फॉर लूप. और हम ये रिपीट कर रहे हैं, तो किस लिए रिपीट कर रहे हैं? इन ऑर्डर टू फाइंड आउट वेदर ईच एलिमेंट इन दिस वेक्टर इज प्राइम और नॉट. ठीक है, सो लेट्स सी कैसे ये काम करता है. इसको रन करें. अच्छा, तो यहां से पहली जो वैल्यू है इस वेक्टर में रैंडम वैल्यू है दैट इज 81. Next is 932, 95, 404, 137. 137 is a prime number. ठीक है, फिर 397, 183 और 373. ठीक है, तो तमाम वैल्यूज को ये बारी बारी चेक करता है कि वो प्राइम नंबर है या नहीं. ठीक है, जी लाइन नंबर को रेफर करें. 4th 7th हियर. ये डिवाइजर की इनिशियल वैल्यू है, यानी n को वी स्टार्ट डिवाइडिंग फ्रॉम 2. व्हाई? बिकॉज 1 इज अ फैक्टर ऑफ अ प्राइम नंबर, सो वी डोंट नीड टू काउंट दैट. सो वी स्टार्ट डिवाइडिंग इट बाय 2 अप अंटिल हाफ ऑफ इट. ठीक है, और एंड वी सी के हमें कोई फैक्टर मिलता है या नहीं. इफ वी फाइंड द फैक्टर, हाउ डू वी डिटरमिन कि ये फैक्टर है या नहीं? वी डू इट दिस वे. सो वी इंक्रीमेंट द वेरिएबल फैक्टर्स. हम कहते हैं कि हमें एक फैक्टर मिल गया, 2 मिल गए, 3 मिल गए, और आखिर में जब हम इस लूप से बाहर निकल जाते हैं, सो वी चेक, वी काउंट द नंबर ऑफ फैक्टर्स. अगर फैक्टर 0 हैं दैट मीन्स कि ये नंबर प्राइम था, इसलिए हमें कोई फैक्टर नहीं मिला बिटवीन 2 and half ऑफ दिस नंबर. और अगर फैक्टर 0 नहीं है, सो दैट मीन्स कि दिस नंबर इज नॉट अ प्राइम नंबर. ठीक है, अच्छा, now hopefully you have been following this code. The first thing that I want you to do is ये कोड क्या कर रहा है? It checks all the elements of a vector A for primality. All the elements of a vector A for primality. Now, what I want you to do is, I want you to modify this is what I want you to do right now. Right now 10:18 का time है. We have time till 11:30, so we have enough time. So what I want you to do is these are in lab tasks. ठीक है. First is modify this program, this script. ठीक है. अच्छा, this script से कौन सी script मुराद है? प्राइम नंबर्स वाली स्क्रिप्ट. Modify this script to find out the prime numbers. ठीक है. To find out the prime numbers and only the prime numbers. ठीक है. Only the prime numbers. यानी you should print के सिर्फ prime numbers का print करें कि ये prime number है. Do not print के this is not a prime number. So modify this script to find out the prime numbers between say 2 and 1000, and say between 5000 and 10,000. ठीक है. सिर्फ 2 से लेकर 1000 के बीच जो प्राइम नंबर्स है सिर्फ वो प्रिंट करें. फिर 5000 से 10,000 के बीच जो प्राइम नंबर्स हैं वो प्रिंट करें. अच्छा, एंड देन मॉडिफाई दिस स्क्रिप्ट, प्राइम नंबर्स वाला ही, टू प्रिंट द फर्स्ट 1000 prime numbers. The first 1000 prime numbers. पहले 1000 prime numbers मालूम करके प्रिंट करें. ठीक है. पहले 1000 prime numbers. इन दोनों में फर्क है. 2 से 1000 के बीच और 5000 से 10,000 के बीच प्राइम नंबर ढूंढना और पहले 1000 प्राइम नंबर्स को ढूंढना, इन दोनों चीज़ों में फ़र्क है. सो यू हैव टू मॉडिफाई दिस स्क्रिप्ट राइट नाउ. ठीक है. इसके अलावा फिर मैं आपको मज़ीद जो टास्क आपने करने हैं आफ्टर लैब, पोस्ट लैब, वो आपको बता दूंगा. यू कैन लुक एट द कोड हियर. ठीक है. दिस इज़ द कोड दैट इज़ यूज्ड फॉर डिटर्मिनिंग वेदर अ नंबर इज़ अ प्राइम नंबर और नॉट. ठीक है. दिस कंप्लीट कोड, यहाँ पे एक एंड का कीवर्ड है which ends this code. This code, it tells you whether n is a prime number or not. ठीक है. This code tells you whether n is a prime number or not. So given this code, you have this code. I want you to modify this code so that you can find out the prime numbers between 2 and 1000, 5000 and 10,000, and then further modify it to find the first 1000 prime numbers. ठीक है. सो गेट स्टार्टेड. ये आपका आज का काम है इन लैब.